Welcome to a Dr. Gideon Fell mystery, where time itself turns traitor. A clock strikes one death too many, and reason must battle the impossible before the final chime fades. When a judge is found dead inside a locked clock tower that struck 13 at midnight, Dr. Gideon Fell must untangle time itself to expose the murderer hiding behind its gears. It makes me so happy to know you're here. Where are you listening from tonight? I always love seeing your comments. Tell me your city, your country, maybe even the weather there. And while you're at it, who's your favorite detective of all time? It was just after midnight, when the bell of Margaret struck 12, a thin, melancholy chime that seemed to drift over the frost-bound roofs of Holborn like a ghostly sigh. At that same moment, a watchman's shout echoed through the narrow lane, a sound of panic, disbelief, and something worse. Or, within minutes, the gas lamps of the close flickered to life, and men in great coats came running from all directions toward the shuttered clock tower that loomed above the parish hall. I had been in London only a week, lodging at the home of my old friend Superintendent Hadley, while conducting research into criminal folklore for the University of Edinburgh. That night I had been asleep when Hadley burst into my room, his overcoat half-buttoned and his bowler in hand. "Sorry to wake you, old man," he said briskly, "but something's happened in Margaret's Close. You'll want to see this, and by heaven, so will Fell." Within 15 minutes we were rattling through the fog in a police motor car. London lay smothered under a skin of white frost. The lamps glowed like dying coals behind veils of mist. As we turned into the Close, the crowd had already gathered, constables holding them back while the coroner's men waited at the tower door. The victim, we learned, was Sir Lionel Fane, a retired judge of some notoriety, known for his iron judgments and his peculiar hobby of clock restoration. He had been found dead at the base of the tower clock, beneath the mechanism he had tended for years. The only door to the clock chamber had been locked from within, and the window, high and narrow, was sealed by thick frost. Yet the corpse lay sprawled across the floor, his cane beside him, and a look of terror frozen on his face. "Locked from inside," muttered Hadley grimly. "No sign of forced entry. No ladder. No second key. He was seen alive 10 minutes before the bell struck." Then he gestured toward the tower door. "No one could have gone in or out." We stepped inside. The chamber was small and circular, the air dense with the metallic scent of oil and brass. The great pendulum swung rhythmically above the body, its polished rod glinting like a sword. On a nearby workbench lay a pocket chronometer, its glass cracked. A candle had guttered out beside it, its wax pooled like tears across a pile of clock gear. But it was the position of the hands that drew Hadley's attention, and mine. The clock above us, which had tolled midnight across the Close, showed a time 5 minutes fast. "Fane was obsessed with punctuality," said Hadley, frowning. "He'd never have let his clock go astray. And yet," before he could finish, a deep voice spoke from behind us, genial and wheezing, like the first rumble of a church organ. "My dear Hadley," said Dr. Gideon Fell, leaning heavily on his cane as he entered, his wide-brimmed hat dusted with frost. "You have brought me out into this infernal weather on a matter involving a dead man, a locked room, and a clock that tells lies. By heaven, that's 3 of my favorite things." He looked around the chamber with immense satisfaction, then turned to me with a twinkle behind his spectacles. "And who, pray, is this fellow chronicling our folly?" Hadley introduced me quickly. Fell bowed with mock ceremony. "Good. You'll write it all down, my boy. The footsteps, the fog, the hour the bell struck. Write it all, and later you'll swear none of it could be true." He moved about the chamber like a slow, revolving planet, his eyes flicking from the body to the clock, from the candle to the window frost. His hand brushed the pendulum's casing. Then he crouched, a mountain of a man bending with surprising delicacy, and studied a smear of something on the stone floor. When he rose again, his expression was unreadable. "A locked tower," he murmured, "a dead judge, a clock that betrays its own hour. and one little touch of theatre. What theatre? I asked. He tapped the air with his cane. You'll see it soon enough. But mind this, gentlemen. When a clock lies, it lies for someone's convenience. And the question is, who? Outside, the frost began to fall again, fine as powdered glass, and from the tower above us, the mechanism gave one soft, lingering tick, though the hands of the clock had stopped dead. Dr. Fell's bulk filled the narrow stairwell as we descended from the clock chamber, the boards creaking beneath his cane. Outside, the mist had thickened into a kind of white wall, through which the lamplight bled in circles. The constables had driven the curious away, leaving only the silent street and the sound of the pendulum still faintly ticking above us. Hadley pulled his collar close, glancing at Fell, who seemed as pleased as a scholar at a rare exhibit. "Do you mean to say," Hadley began, "that this wasn't suicide?" "Suicide," Fell repeated, his eyebrows lifting like shutters. "My dear Hadley, if Sir Lionel Fane meant to take his own life, he'd not have locked the door and then conveniently lost the key." "But there was no key," I said. "You saw for yourself. It wasn't on him, nor in the lock." "Precisely," Fell wheezed. "And therefore, my boy, someone else must have had it, and used it in a manner that would make Whodunit blush." He paused to light his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his broad, ruddy face. "Tell me, Hadley, who found the body?" "One of the vergers," Hadley replied. "He heard the midnight bell strike, and thought he saw the tower light flicker. Went up, found the door bolted, called for help, broke it down, and there was Fane stone dead." "Good," murmured Fell, puffing contentedly. "And what did our medical man say?" "Heart failure, likely from shock," Hadley said. "But the bruising on the neck, well, that doesn't fit." "Ah," said Fell softly, "the clock strikes murder indeed." We rode back through the sleeping city, the motor car cutting a path through the fog like a knife through wool. By the time we reached Fell's house in Hampstead, dawn was threatening the horizon, a pale line behind the chimneys. Inside, the old scholar's study glowed with lamplight and the scent of tobacco. Bookshelves towered like ramparts, and on the mantelpiece stood a row of strange relics: Egyptian scarabs, a Roman key, a tiny model of a guillotine. Fell poured himself ale and gestured for us to sit. "Now," he said, settling heavily into his armchair, "we must consider the matter logically. The facts as known: Sir Lionel Fane was alive and alone 10 minutes before midnight. The clock strikes 12, heard by half the parish. At that moment he is already dead. The door is locked from inside. The window cannot be opened. No weapon, no key, no exit." Hadley rubbed his temples. "Which leaves what? The devil himself?" Fell chuckled, a deep, booming sound. "No devils, my friend. Only men and their ingenious deceits. Remember, Hadley, that every impossibility vanishes when one asks how it appeared so. The trick lies not in the locked door, but in what we are meant to believe about it." He leaned forward suddenly, eyes glinting. "Fetch me the verger's statement, and send a man to search the clock face outside. If I'm not mistaken, the truth may be hanging just above our heads." The verger, a pale and nervous man named Collis, arrived at Fell's house an hour later, still trembling from lack of sleep and the memory of what he'd seen. He sat rigidly on the edge of his chair, while Hadley questioned him, his cap twisting in his hands. Fell watched from the hearth, puffing on his pipe, the smoke rising like faint church incense into the lamplight. "It were a few minutes before midnight, sir," Collis began. "I just finished checking the vestry, when I saw the light still burning in the tower. That's odd, thought I, since Sir Lionel always put it out sharp at 11. Then the clock started to strike, clear as anything, and I swear the flame flickered, like it was fighting the dark. I went to the door, knocked, no answer. I called twice, and still nothing. Then I saw smoke, just a thin wisp curling from under the door. That's when I called the constable." "Smoke?" repeated Hadley. "The fire brigade reported none." Collis hesitated. Aye, sir. It was gone by the time they broke the door. I might have imagined it. The light can play tricks, you know, through that old oak. Fell removed the pipe from his mouth and tapped it against the mantel. Smoke that vanishes, he murmured. A light that flickers when the bell strikes. My dear Hadley, we are not looking at the devil's handiwork, but we are looking at a magician's. Hadley's brow furrowed. Meaning, said Fell, that every conjurer depends upon misdirection. While the eye attends one thing, the clock striking, the hand performs another unseen. Now, note, the clock was 5 minutes fast. Suppose someone adjusted it, intending that the chime should coincide with the fatal act. Time, gentlemen, is the surest accomplice of murder. He rose, thrusting his arms into his greatcoat. We shall pay another visit to Margaret's Close, before the frost melts, and with it our evidence. The drive back through the pale dawn was ghostly. London streets, empty and glazed with ice, seemed drawn in silver lines. The tower loomed ahead, its face dim in the fog. A constable saluted as we entered. Inside, the chamber was colder than before, the air heavy with the scent of brass, and something faintly acrid, like spent powder. Fell's eyes darted upward to the ceiling beams. You've examined the clock face outside? He asked. Yes, sir, replied a young sergeant. Nothing out of the ordinary, save for this. He handed Fell a small scrap of burnt paper, caught between the outer gear and the frame. Looks like parchment. Fell took it delicately. The smoke that wasn't smoke. He turned to Hadley. Have this analyzed, but I'd wager it's tracing paper, used in mechanical drafts, burned to destroy evidence of tampering, perhaps. And yet here we are. He slipped the fragment into his pocket and glanced toward the stair. We are nearing the hinge of the trick, gentlemen. Somewhere between that bell stroke and that broken candle lies the key to the room, and I rather fancy it's a key no locksmith ever forged. The daylight, when it finally broke through the fog, came cold and colorless, like light seeping through old parchment. Fell remained in the tower chamber long after the others had grown restless. He stood before the frozen window, puffing steadily at his pipe while his eyes roamed the gears and brass weights with the patience of a man deciphering scripture. I watched him trace a finger along the pendulum's casing, pause at a notch in the floorboards, and then stoop with a wheeze to peer beneath the workbench. When he straightened, he was smiling faintly, as though he had heard the faintest whisper of an answer. Hadley, meanwhile, was questioning one of Sir Lionel's servants, a stiff and anxious woman named Mrs. Fane, his niece by marriage, and we later learned, his only heir. Her voice trembled between indignation and fear as she spoke. My uncle was not well. Superintendent, the doctor warned him often, but he was too proud to admit weakness. Always in that tower, tinkering with those infernal cogs. Did he quarrel with anyone recently? Hadley asked. She hesitated, then said, there was a matter of inheritance. My cousin Henry had expected to be favored in the will, but Uncle Lionel changed it last month, said something about character and punctuality as if those were the same thing. Henry left the house that evening in a temper. Phil turned at that, his eyes brightening. A quarrel about time, how poetic, and how convenient. Tell me, madam, did your uncle ever leave that clock to strike unattended? Never, she said quickly. He insisted on winding it himself every night. He said no one else understood its balance. Fell nodded, his cane tapping the floor thoughtfully. Indeed, balance is everything. In clocks and in murder. When Mrs. Fane departed, Fell drew near to the door of the chamber and examined the lock. It was an old mortise type, solid brass, the sort that required a long key. Observe, Hadley, he said, holding up the bolt. It shoots true and clean. No tampering here, yet the door was locked when they broke it in. Therefore the question is not how it was locked, but when. Hadley frowned. You mean the door might have been locked after the murder? But by whom? said Fell softly. That is the puzzle, isn't it? We assume the killer fled before the verger arrived. But what if, by illusion of sound or sight, he seemed to flee when he had never been here at all? The remark left me cold. Fell stood before the clock face again, tapping his cane against the floorboards in a steady rhythm that echoed the pendulum's swing. Gentlemen, he murmured, I suspect that clock struck not only 12 last night, but also an alibi. He smiled, broad and beatific as though the devil himself had confessed, and when a machine tells a lie, he added, it is always because a man taught it how. That afternoon the fog thickened again, drawing its curtain across Holborn like the closing of a theatre scene. Headley and I returned to headquarters to sort witness statements, but Fell refused to leave the tower until sunset. When he finally emerged, he looked almost cheerful, his cape swinging behind him, the frost sparkling on its edge like powdered glass. He announced, to Headley's irritation, that he had been listening to time itself and that it had told him a small lie. We reconvened in Sir Lionel's drawing room that evening, where the household sat in strange silence. Mrs. Fane, pale but composed, offered tea with trembling hands. Her cousin Henry Fane stood by the window, smoking with an air of forced calm. He was tall, thin, and impeccably dressed, but there was a twitch in his mouth when he spoke. Inspector, this is ridiculous, he said flatly. My uncle's death was natural. He was 72, for heaven's sake. You're chasing ghosts in a clock tower, Hadley replied. Perhaps, but ghosts don't lock doors or reset clocks, Mr. Fane. Phil was seated in an enormous armchair, the tip of his cane tracing lazy circles on the carpet. Tell me, sir, he boomed suddenly, you were seen leaving this house on the evening before the murder. At what hour did you return? Henry hesitated. A little after 11. I went to the Bell and Crown for a drink. I can produce the landlord's word for it. Ooh, I've no doubt you can, said Fell. But tell me something else. You're mechanically inclined, are you not? Your uncle's hobby must have influenced you. I've no patience for machines, Henry snapped. Those endless ticking things drove me mad. Fell smiled benignly. Yes, ticking can do that, especially when one has something to hide. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Fane set down her teacup with a small clink, and Henry turned toward Fell, his expression caught between anger and alarm. What are you implying? Nothing yet, said Fell, his tone almost jovial. Only that your uncle's clock struck at a time when it should not have, and that someone in this house profited by that deception. Hadley looked up sharply. You found the mechanism of it, then? Not quite, Fell said. But I have found what should be there, and isn't. A small brass counterweight, missing from the clock's escapement. Harmless enough, you'd say, except that without it, the clock runs precisely 5 minutes fast. Someone removed it, deliberately. The question is whether that someone removed it before the murder or after. He rose, leaning heavily on his cane, and the room seemed to contract around his bulk. Mrs. Fane, I advise no one to leave this house tonight. I fancy our murderer is within it still. And by tomorrow morning, when the bells strike again, I mean to prove it. He turned toward me with a glint in his eye. Do keep your notebook handy, my boy. Tomorrow, I shall demonstrate how time itself can be used as an accomplice and a witness. That night passed in uneasy quiet. Hadley and I remained at the Fane house by Fell's instruction, while 2 constables guarded the clock tower and another kept watch at the garden gate. A fire burned low in the drawing room, where the heavy ticking of the mantel clock seemed louder with every passing minute. Mrs. Fane had retired early, pleading exhaustion, but her cousin Henry lingered by the window, restless and pacing. Fell, untroubled as a stone Buddha, sat with his hands folded over the head of his cane, eyes half closed behind his spectacles. The air felt heavy, charged, as though waiting for something unseen to happen. It was near 11 when Fell stirred at last. Hadley, he said suddenly, You sent men to watch the tower, yes? Good. Then we shall pay our own visit at midnight. I think our murderer left us one last performance to attend. Hadley sighed. Suppose you'll tell me this has nothing to do with ghosts. Ghosts? Fell chuckled, rising with effort. My dear Hadley, ghosts lack imagination. Men, however, men have just enough. We left the house and stepped into the bitter air. The fog had thinned to a faint silver haze, through which the tower loomed like a phantom. Our boots rang on the stones. From above, the steady pendulum tick carried faintly, rhythmic as a pulse. The constable at the gate saluted, his breath clouding in the cold. All quiet, sir, he said. Too quiet, murmured Fell. The dead are seldom so considerate. Inside the clock chamber, the scene was as we had left it. The tools, the candle stub, the faint scent of metal and oil. Yet something subtle had changed. Fell's eyes darted to the window, then to the pendulum. He leaned forward, sniffed, and touched the brass rod. Warm, he said softly, and yet no fire. Curious, is it not? Hadley frowned. You think someone's been here? I think, said Fell, that someone wanted us to believe otherwise. He gestured to me. Note this, if you please. The pendulum has been recently disturbed. The warmth comes from friction. Someone attempted to reset the clock within the last half hour. Hadley turned to the constable. You saw no one enter? No, sir, not a soul. Precisely, said Fell, and that, gentlemen, is the neatest trick of all. For our murderer never left. Before we could question him, a sudden cry echoed from below, the voice of a woman. We rushed down the narrow stairs and into the courtyard, where Mrs. Fane stood at the garden path, her night cloak drawn tight about her shoulders. It's Henry, she gasped. He's gone. His room's empty. Hadley swore under his breath, and ordered the constables to search the grounds. Fell only smiled faintly. Gone, is he? Then let us see where time leads him. Half an hour later, Henry Fane was found not far from the river embankment, crouched beside a small valise. Inside were papers, a train ticket, and a silver key, the twin unmistakably of the one that fitted the tower door. Hadley seized him at once. You were running, Fane. Why? Henry's face was pale, his voice breaking. I wasn't running. I swear it. I came back for the key. I'd lost it days ago. You can't think of... Phil's voice cut through like thunder. You lost it? Nonsense, sir. You used it, and when the clock struck 12, it was your own careful hand that made certain the door was locked, though not from within. Henry stared at him, stunned. Fell raised a hand. But we shall not condemn you yet. There is still one piece of the mechanism missing, and until I find it, time itself keeps its secret. Henry Fane was taken back to the house under guard, his face white and drained, his lips trembling between protest and despair. Mrs. Fane met him in the hall, her eyes wide with fright. Henry, what have you done? She whispered, but he only shook his head, muttering that it was all a mistake. Hadley ordered him confined to the study until morning, and then turned to Fell, who stood by the mantel as unhurried as a man waiting for a cab. You've got him now, Hadley said. He had motive, the key, and the chance. What more do you need? Proof, said Fell simply, lowering himself into an armchair with a sigh. And proof, my dear Hadley, is not always the thing that shouts the loudest. It's the quiet, overlooked voice that whispers too late. He removed his hat and placed it on his knee. Tell me, Hadley, did you notice the state of the floor near the tower door? Cold and dry, Hadley replied. What of it? Exactly so, said Fell, with sudden animation. Yet the verger swore he saw smoke. No fire, no scorch marks, no oil. What kind of smoke? Leaves no trace. The answer, of course, is none at all. It wasn't smoke, it was dust. He turned to me, his eyes gleaming. The clock's pendulum has been tampered with, yet the dust beneath it was undisturbed. So imagine, gentlemen, that the murderer struck before midnight, when the clock still stood still. He locked the door from outside, using a trick of leverage through the narrow hinge gap, a simple cord, pulled tight, that snapped away when the door was forced open. Then he climbed out the narrow maintenance hatch near the roof, descended by the exterior ladder, and set the hands of the clock 5 minutes fast, ensuring the death would appear to coincide with the bell stroke. Hadley blinked. You mean to say the whole business was staged, to make it look as though he died exactly at midnight? Precisely, said Fell. And who but Henry would know enough about the mechanism to alter it so precisely? The key, the timing, the inheritance, all convenient. But he did not sound satisfied. He leaned back, eyes half shut, the firelight gleaming off his spectacles. And yet, he murmured, it's too neat, a conjuring trick without applause. I don't believe Henry is the magician. A silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Then Fell rose again, slow but deliberate, like a mountain shifting its weight. Hadley, see that no one leaves this house till morning. There is something in that tower still unaccounted for, a sound I heard faint but certain when we stood within it. Hadley frowned. What sound? Fell paused at the doorway, his cane tapping once on the floor. The 13th stroke, he said softly. The clock struck 12 times for the world to hear, but it struck 13 for me. And when a clock does that, my dear Hadley, you can be sure that somewhere inside it, a man's secret heart is still ticking. The night deepened, pressing upon the old house with the stillness of a tomb. The frost thickened on the panes until even the stars disappeared, and only the soft, irregular tick of the drawing-room clock broke the silence. Hadley had gone upstairs to confer with the constables, leaving me alone with Dr. Fell, who sat by the fire like an enormous idol, his great shoulders hunched, and his eyes half-lidded beneath the reflection of the flames. He had not spoken since his cryptic remark about the 13th stroke, yet there was nothing idle about his silence. It was the quiet of calculation, of some monstrous theory forming in the dark. At last he stirred. "Tell me," he said, "what is time?" I hesitated. "Time, sir." "Yes," he said, leaning forward. "Our murderer has been playing with it, as though it were string. Time struck wrong. The clock lied. The very air of that tower was thick with deception. So, what is time in a crime? I searched for an answer and failed. Fell's pipe made a dull glow as he drew on it, exhaling a slow wreath of smoke. Time, my boy, is witness. When all human eyes are closed, time remains awake. But the trick lies in persuading time to lie on your behalf. That's what our man tried and failed to do. Before I could question him further, the door opened softly, and Mrs. Fane entered. She looked frightened, but also curiously composed, as if she had crossed from despair into resolve. "Dr. Fell," she said, "may I speak to you alone?" Fell gestured gravely. "As you wish, madam." She glanced at me, then lowered her voice. "It isn't Henry. He's impulsive, foolish perhaps, but he would never harm Uncle Lionel. There's something you don't know." "Indeed?" said Fell. "Then pray enlighten us." "Last week," she whispered, "my uncle received a letter. It was unsigned. He burned it immediately, but I read part of it before he did. It accused him of perjury, of having sent an innocent man to the gallows 20 years ago. He was terrified, though he tried to hide it. The letter said he would be struck at the hour he most revered." Basille's eyes gleamed. "At midnight," he said softly. "The hour of precision and law. Yes, I begin to see the shape of it." She twisted her handkerchief. "Uncle said it was the work of a lunatic, but he locked himself in that tower every night since. He said only his clock would tell the truth." "His clock," Fell repeated, almost to himself. "The one thing he trusted, and the one thing that betrayed him." He looked up sharply. "Madam, do you know who built that clock?" "Yes, a craftsman from Paddington, Mr. Harold Dunning." He and my uncle quarrelled bitterly years ago over payment. Dunning accused him of stealing a design. I believe he died in prison not long after. Fell slapped his knee. By heaven, Hadley's arrest may be premature after all. For our ghost may be more literal than we thought, not in the flesh, but in revenge executed by proxy. Just then the door burst open. Hadley strode in, his face grim. Henry Fane's gone again. The constable outside his door swears he never stirred, but the man's vanished like smoke. Fell rose instantly, his whole frame vibrating with purpose. Gone? Then the trick repeats itself. Hadley, get your men to the tower at once. We raced out into the freezing night. The moon had broken through the fog, painting the stones with ghostly light. From the tower came a sound that made my blood run cold, the steady, unnatural rhythm of the clock, striking again. 13 slow, echoing tolls. By the time we reached the door, it was bolted from within. Fell's eyes shone behind his spectacles. "Do not break it yet," he commanded. "Listen." From within came a faint, dragging sound, like metal scraping stone. Then silence. Fell's face grew dark. "Now," he said. Hadley's men battered the door open. Inside lay Henry Fane, sprawled across the floor in front of the clock, his coat smeared with oil and soot. He was unconscious but breathing. The clock's hands stood frozen at 12 again, and beside him the missing brass counterweight gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Hadley knelt beside him, bewildered. What in blazes was he doing? Fell moved slowly around the chamber, inspecting each detail: the dropped key, the overturned stool, the smear of dust on the floorboards. He was trying to restore what he thought he had broken, Fell said softly. But he didn't understand the trick. He thought guilt was a matter of mechanism, when in truth it was illusion. He bent closer to the clock face, then struck it sharply with his cane. Something small and metallic fell from a hidden recess, a coiled length of wire, knotted at one end. Fell held it up triumphantly. Behold, the murderer's device, a simple cord threaded through the door hinge and wound about the lock's interior. Pull from without, and the bolt shoots home. Then cut the cord and it vanishes into the mechanism when the door is forced. Hadley's eyes widened. So it could be locked from inside while the killer stood outside. Exactly, said Fell. And who would know how to contrive such a thing? Only a craftsman, or one who knew the craftsman's secret. He turned to me, eyes blazing. Tomorrow, my boy, we shall pay a visit to the grave of Mr. Harold Dunning, and to the man who inherited his tools. The pendulum of justice, as ever, swings both ways. The morning that followed was pale and sharp, a winter blade cutting through the grey air of Holborn. Henry Fane still lay under medical supervision, his mind clouded by exhaustion and shock, muttering half-coherent fragments about the 13th strike and the clock that lies. Hadley had ordered him kept in custody, though Fell had discouraged any formal charge until the full mechanism of the crime could be demonstrated. We breakfasted in grim silence, Fell demolishing a plate of kippers and eggs while his mind whirred as visibly as the clockwork he hunted. Hadley, he said at last, pushing his plate aside. You've made inquiries regarding Harold Dunning? Yes, said Hadley, consulting a file. He died in prison 3 years ago. Fraud and forgery, sold counterfeit patents to several firms. Left behind one son, Arthur Dunning, who runs a small repair shop in Paddington. Bit of a recluse by all accounts. Fell nodded approvingly, stuffing his pipe. The sons of craftsmen, half bitterness, half pride. They inherit more than tools, Hadley. They inherit grievances. We shall call on him immediately. The shop stood on a narrow street off Praed Road, wedged between a tobacconist and a shuttered dairy. Its windows were so grimy that even daylight seemed reluctant to enter. Inside, the air smelled of metal filings and turpentine. and the shelves were cluttered with the detritus of a mechanical age, clock cases, pendulums, spindles, gears, each tagged and labeled in spidery writing. Behind the counter sat a lean grey man in a work apron, his eyes as sharp as the instruments that surrounded him. He rose when Fell entered, leaning heavily on his cane, his vast shape nearly filling the narrow doorway. "Mr. Arthur Dunning, I believe," Fell boomed genially. "You may not know me, sir, but I've long admired your father's work, especially that elegant locking mechanism used in Margaret's Tower." The man stiffened. "My father's work died with him," he said curtly. "If you're from the yard, I've nothing more to add to their questions." Hadley stepped forward. "We're here about Sir Lionel Fane. He's dead. You knew him." Dunning's jaw tightened. "I knew of him. The man ruined my father, stole his design, mocked his name in court, and saw him imprisoned. He deserved every tick of that cursed clock that measured his own time out." Fell puffed his pipe thoughtfully. "And did you repair that same clock for him last autumn?" "I did," Dunning said after a pause. "He sent for me, paid double the rate, and made me swear to keep the mechanism secret. I told him I'd not touch it, but," his voice faltered, "but when I saw what he'd done to it, I pitied him. It was no longer a clock. It was a confession written in brass and gear." Fell's eyes gleamed. "Confession?" Dunning met his gaze squarely. He'd replaced one of the striking gears with a false one, engraved with a name. "My father's." He said it reminded him to be precise, but precision had long ceased to be his virtue. "When I saw that, I altered the mechanism so it would gain 5 minutes every night. A small jest, I thought, to remind him that even the righteous can lose time." Hadley's voice was sharp. "You tampered with it deliberately." "Yes, but I never meant him harm. He wrote me 3 days before his death, said he'd forgiven everything, and wanted me to visit. I never went." Fell exhaled heavily. So the groundwork was laid years ago. Resentment, guilt, the seed of fear planted in the heart of an old man. Someone else, knowing of your alteration, exploited it. Someone close enough to see the wound and turn it to murder. Dunning frowned. "You mean his nephew?" "Possibly," said Fell, "but not necessarily." He leaned over the counter, his gaze suddenly fierce. "When you adjusted the mechanism, did you leave any means by which the clock could be locked from outside the tower?" Dunning shook his head. "No. That tower's door was foolproof, unless someone had the master key." Fell's cane struck the floor sharply. "Then we have it, Hadley. A key forged from guilt and opportunity. Henry Fane may have wielded it, but he did not shape it." We left the shop as the church bells of Paddington chimed 11. The frost had begun to melt, dripping from the eaves like faint applause. Fell walked in silence for several minutes before he said quietly, "Do you remember what Mrs. Fane told us of the letter of a man unjustly condemned?" "Yes," I said. "You think the writer was Dunning's son?" "No," said Fell, shaking his head. "Arthur Dunning's bitterness is honest. His hands are skilled, not deceitful. That letter was written by someone with theatrical flair, a manipulator, a person who would understand how to stage a scene, how to turn guilt into performance." He stopped in his tracks, eyes narrowing. "And who better than Mrs. Fane herself?" Hadley stared. "You mean the widow?" "She is neither widow nor fool," Fell interrupted. "She inherited everything. She watched her uncle's mind fray under guilt and superstition, nudged by a letter she herself composed. She needed only the illusion of impossibility to seal the matter, a locked door, a timed bell, a nephew to blame. Gentlemen, we return to Margaret's Close. Before the next clock strikes, I intend to make time tell the truth again." We found Margaret's Close, wrapped again in its pale noon hush, the tower standing as blank and impassive as a juror who already knows his verdict. Fell sent Hadley ahead to secure the chamber and post a constable at the stairhead, while I went with him to the Fane house. Mrs. Fane received us in the morning room, with its icy bay window and stiff damask chairs. The frostlight lay across her face and made her look both younger and harder. She offered tea with mechanical courtesy. Fell declined with a wheezy thanks and lowered his vast person into a chair that protested softly. "My dear madam," he said, "we are to hold an experiment this very afternoon in the tower. I should be delighted if you would attend." Her hands tightened on the tray. "An experiment?" "Only a demonstration of the clock's peculiarities," he replied, puffing contentedly. "You see, the machine is honest, but it can be taught to lie. When we show how the lie is told, it will cease to be convincing." She tried to meet his gaze, and could not. "Inspector Headley has already made up his mind, I suppose, about Henry." "On the contrary," said Fell, "Hadley means to release your cousin provisionally. Fresh evidence has turned suspicion another way." He said this so mildly that for an instant the room seemed to draw breath. "I have asked Arthur Dunning to attend also. There will be nothing dramatic, I promise you, only the pedestrian business of setting time right." The porcelain cup touched its saucer with a faint click. She managed to smile. "If it will lay all this horror to rest, Dr. Fell, of course I shall come." We crossed the close a quarter of an hour before 3. The tower door stood open, a constable before it. The interior smelled of brass, paraffin, and cold stone. Hadley, who had the look of a man preserving patience with both hands, nodded to us and indicated the arrangements. "I've placed men where you wanted them," he told Fell. "Sergeant Owens in the nave below to listen for the chimes, Constable Martin in the close outside, and I've kept a man with Henry at the house. He'll be brought here when you signal." "Excellent," said Fell. "Now, my boy," he meant me, "you will remain here in the chamber with me. Pen ready. What you hear, you will mark. What you see, you will mark. And what you think you understand, you will refrain from saying aloud. Hadley, you and Miss Fane stand just at the threshold. Dunning, you have come." Arthur Dunning hovered in the doorway, shoulders slightly stooped, hat in hand. His glance skittered past Mrs. Fane without resting. "I've brought the drawings you asked for," he said, lifting a roll of papers. "The governor, the striking train, the stop-in, and the maintenance hatch measurements, all to scale." Fell took them with an approving grunt and spread them over the workbench beside the cracked chronometer and guttered candle. He teased the papers flat with 2 brass cogs. "Be so good as to note, gentlemen," he said, tapping the sketch of the striking train, "the position of the stop pin that arrests the hammer after 12. If tampered with to hang a fraction to the left, the hammer may overrun and give a feeble half blow. No sound for the parish, but a ghost of a stroke in the chamber. That was our 13th. Heard by me, not by the world." Hadley leaned closer. "A mechanical hiccup?" "A hiccup taught it," Fell returned, amiable as a lecturer, addressing sleepy undergraduates. "Now, the rest of the trick is older than Robert Houdin. Here at the hinge, a narrow chink, and through it a wire run to the bolt case. Our coiled souvenir." He showed the knotted wire he had found, "fits nicely in that race. A tug from outside shoots the bolt. A snip and a pull leave the end to be swallowed by the hungry works when the door is forced. Nothing supernatural, merely the ingenuity of an embittered man or a frightened woman." Mrs. Fane had not moved. Her eyes were fastened on the machine. I could not tell if she listened at all to Fell's honeyed tone. The pale light gave her profile a clean chiseled severity. "Proceed," said Hadley, dry as biscuit. "With pleasure," Fell boomed. "We shall reenact, allowing for daylight, the murder's theatre. At the instant we choose in place of midnight, the clock will strike. Dunning, you will stand in the nave below, in the same place as your sergeant. Hadley and Mrs. Fane at the threshold. My young friend and I, within, Constable Martin in the close. Each will write precisely what he hears and when. And this," he held up the small brass counterweight, "polished now, goes back where it ought to be, to correct the machine's habit of running 5 minutes fast. That error was the curtain pull for the show." He set the weight with deft fingers surprising in so large a man. Then he adjusted the fan governor with the gentlest pressure of his thumb. The great pendulum took on a steadier, deeper rhythm. The whole chamber seemed to pulse with it. Fell timed the beat with the cracked chronometer, smiled and shut its lid. "When I raise my cane," he said, "we are at our chosen hour." Hadley cleared his throat. "And Henry?" "Presently," said Fell, "one actor at a time." The chamber had a curious hush as we waited, a hush that made the faintest frictions sing. I heard the tiny rasp of Fell's sleeve as he drew breath, the soft scrape of Mrs. Fane's boot on the stone threshold, the distant whisper of a page turning in Dunning's sketch roll as he fidgeted below. When Fell raised his cane, the hammer began to lift. It struck once clean, metallic, twice, thrice. The sound went out into the close and a fraction later returned as echo, lessened and softened, as though a second and ghostly bell had answered the first. I wrote as fast as I could. Fell, without looking at me, counted under his breath. 7, 8, 9. The 10th stroke had a faint overlap, a little smear around the edges, and the 11th, the 12th came thin, almost ashamed of itself, and then, inside the chamber, only the tiniest, apologetic tick of the hammer, kissing metal without force. A 13th that was not a 13, but a private stutter. Fell lowered his cane. "That," he said, "is what I heard on the night. That is what told me the murder did not take place at the public 12, but at the private one. The inward stutter when the governor was misset. Whoever set it that way had to be here after the last servicing, and whoever knew how to set it did not learn from Henry." He went to the door and called down, his voice like a bell in its own right. "Sergeant Owens, your notes. Constable Martin, yours. Hadley, be so kind as to ask your man to bring Henry now." In a few minutes Henry came up the stair, unsteady but determined, a bruise dark at his temple, where he had fallen in the night. His gaze slid quickly to Mrs. Fane and away again. He looked not like a villain, but like a man who had been too long in airless rooms. Fell folded his hands atop his cane and regarded them both with benign melancholy. "Now, before we proceed to the last piece," he said, "a word or two about letters and smoke. Verger Collis thought he saw smoke beneath this door when the bell struck. There was none. We found a charred shred caught in the outer gear, a bit of tracing paper, the kind used for drafts, laid upon a warm metal and touched to a candle gutter. It will lift a breath of dust as it curls, imitating smoke to a tired eye. That breath, my dears, was the signal that the play had begun. Someone inside the house wanted the verger to call help at exactly the moment when no help would do." Mrs. Fane's lips parted. Whether in protest or breath, I could not tell. Fell turned his spectacles full on her, and his voice, while kindly, admitted no pretense. "You wrote the letter to your uncle. You, not Dunning. You typed it on the little machine in the morning room, and burned it while he watched. After you had already copied it out in another hand, you told him he would be struck at the hour he loved. He went to his tower as a monk to matins, believing that the clock, at least, would keep faith. You fed his fear with whispers about the Dunning affair, which you knew from your late husband's paper. You meant to make him die of apoplexy if you could, but if he would not oblige, you had a string and a hinge and a counterfeit 13th stroke." Hadley made a small, involuntary movement. Henry did nothing at all. He had grown very still. She swallowed, then said softly, "Why would I do any of that, Dr. Fell?" "Because," Fell replied, "you had everything to gain and nothing, so you thought, to lose. Henry would take the blame, driven by his temper and his foolish attempt to put the mechanism right. You had altered the clock subtly after Dunning's visit. Your housekeeping keys give entry everywhere, including to the vestry chest where the master key lay. You removed the counterweight to make the clock fast. You learned the trick of the hinge with the help of a certain manual your husband left. He represented insurance firms, and such manuals are full of practical wickedness. When the bell struck its counterfeit 12, you were in the doorway with Collis's smoke in his eyes, ready to cry out. It was theatre, Mrs. Fane. And no one loves theatre more than a frightened woman who believes life has wronged her. She stood very straight. You have proof of none of this, she said, but her voice frayed at the edges. Oh, but I have proof, Fell said, almost tenderly. I asked Dunning to look at your sewing basket when we were at the house. He told me there was clock wire in it, a thin spool dyed with blue chalk, used to mark fabric. There is no reason in the world for a lady to own clock wire dyed blue, unless she has been threading it through a brass hinge. The dust on the sill of the maintenance hatch shows small white fibers caught in the grit, silk from your cloak fringe. And finally he opened his hand to reveal a small brass screw. This was loose beneath the workbench, smeared with carnauba wax. The only carnauba in this house is in the polish you keep in the morning room. You steadied your hand with it when you reset the governor, because your hands shook. I'm not blaming you for the shaking, but wax is a faithful witness. Hadley's breath went out like a man who has climbed a hill and at last sees the road. The room seemed to narrow to a single point where Mrs. Fane stood. She looked at Henry, and for a moment I thought she would fling herself upon him in appeal or accusation, but she did neither. She put her hand flat upon the cold brass of the pendulum case and left it there, as though feeling for a pulse. When she spoke, the words came with terrible calm. He would have left everything to that boy, she said. After all my years of quiet, after I put my life into this house while Lionel polished his virtue on that clock and talked of character. He was not a good man, Dr. Fell. He merely measured himself by seconds. She lifted her hand. I wrote a letter to make him tremble. I learned the hinge for drama's sake, but I never touched that wretched governor. Fell looked almost sorrowful. Madam, it is the smallest turn, the one that makes the hammer whisper 13, that lies at the heart of this. Whether your hand or another's did it. He paused, glanced at the cracked chronometer, and shook his head, thoughtfully. No, not yet. The machine can confess as eloquently as any person, but we shall let it do so in its own hour. Hadley, be good enough to keep all parties within call. At sunset we shall hold our second demonstration, and this time we shall ask the clock to strike not for the parish, but for justice. He turned his back on the stunned chamber and stumped to the door, cane thocking in measured beat with the pendulum's patient arc. My boy, he added to me, with a faint, almost apologetic smile. Write it all, every word, every dust mote, for when we have arranged the details in their proper order, you will see that nothing here has been inexplicable, only unlabeled.